There is exactly one message worth sending a narcissist when you go no contact. And it isn't the one most people send. It isn't the angry paragraph explaining everything they did wrong. It isn't the tearful plea for them to finally understand. It isn't even the cold clipped lose my number text people imagine delivers the perfect mic drop moment. Most of the messages empaths send in the final moments of a relationship with a narcissist are, understandably, built to accomplish something they were never going to accomplish. Making the other person finally see, finally feel, finally understand the weight of what happened. And I want to tell you clearly, before we go any further, why none of those messages work and what the one message that actually protects you looks like instead. Let's start with why the instinct to send a long, detailed, explanatory message is so strong in the first place, because understanding the instinct is the first step to resisting it. After months or years inside a relationship where your feelings were minimized, your perceptions questioned, your reality constantly renegotiated in someone else's favor, there's a deep, completely understandable hunger to finally say it all. Every unaddressed grievance, every moment you bit your tongue to keep the peace, every pattern you saw clearly, but never had the safety to name out loud. The final message often becomes the place where all of that gets poured out at once, because it feels like the last opportunity you'll ever have to make sure they understand the full scope of what they did. Here's the uncomfortable truth about that message, the one almost nobody wants to hear in the moment they're drafting it. It doesn't work, and it was never going to work, regardless of how precisely you word it, how much evidence you include, how calmly or how passionately you deliver it. This isn't because your grievances aren't valid, they almost certainly are. It's because the message is built on a mistaken assumption about what's actually happening on the other end. You're writing to be understood. They're reading to find the angle. A narcissist receiving a long, detailed accounting of everything they did wrong doesn't experience it as an invitation to reflect. They experience it as material, evidence of exactly how invested you still are, information about which points landed hardest and can therefore be exploited hardest. Proof that the relationship, despite your declared ending, is still very much alive in your mind, which means it's still very much workable from theirs. This is the single most important thing to understand before we get to what actually works. Every word you send a narcissist during a breakup is being processed through a completely different filter than the one you're writing through. You're writing from a place of hurt, hoping for acknowledgement. They're reading from a place of threat assessment, looking for leverage. A detailed emotional message, however justified, however true, hands them exactly what they need to begin the process of pulling you back in, because it proves the one thing that actually matters to them, that you're still reachable. So what does the one message that actually protects you look like? It's short, it's unremarkable. It contains no accusations, no explanations, no emotional content for them to work with at all. It sounds something like this: I won't be responding to further contact. Please don't reach out again. That's it. No justification, no accounting of grievances, no invitation, even implicit for a response. I know this feels deeply unsatisfying if you're imagining sending it right now, and I want to address that honestly, because the dissatisfaction is real and it matters. This message doesn't give you the catharsis of finally saying everything. It doesn't force them to sit with the full weight of what they did. It doesn't produce the apology, the acknowledgement, or the understanding you've probably spent a long time hoping to eventually receive. And here's the piece that's genuinely hard to accept, but that changes everything once you do. None of those things were ever available to you through any message, no matter how it was worded. The catharsis you're looking for doesn't come from what you send them. It comes from what you decide to release internally, regardless of whether they ever receive or acknowledge a single word of it. This is worth understanding at a deeper, more mechanical level, because it explains exactly why the short, boundary-focused message is the only one that actually functions the way you want a final message to function. A detailed emotional message gives a narcissist information about your internal state. what specifically hurt you, what you're still processing, where your defenses are thinnest. This information becomes exactly what gets used in every subsequent hoovering attempt, whether that attempt comes a week later or a year later. If you told them in your final message that their coldness during your father's illness was the moment you finally understood the relationship was unsalvageable, that detail becomes a tool. A future message referencing your father, offering sudden warmth or apparent remorse specifically calibrated to that wound, becomes far more effective than it would have been if they'd never known exactly where to aim. The short message denies them this information entirely. It doesn't tell them what worked, what hurt, what specifically ended things. It simply states a boundary and stops. This isn't coldness for its own sake. It's information security applied to the one relationship where handing over emotional information has always historically been used against you. Here's the second reason the short message matters so much, and it's psychological rather than strategic. The length and emotional intensity of a final message is itself a signal, independent of its actual content. A long, detailed, passionate message, even an angry one, signals ongoing investment. It says implicitly, "This still matters enormously to me. I am still deeply engaged with processing what happened between us." A short, flat, boundary-only message signals something entirely different. This is administrative. This is a formality. This isn't a wound being reopened for discussion. It's a door being closed, briefly noted and left behind. Narcissists are, whether consciously or not, exceptionally attuned to this kind of signal because their entire relational strategy depends on accurately assessing how much emotional leverage they still have. A short, flat message reads as low leverage. It doesn't invite continued engagement because there's nothing in it to engage with. This is precisely why so many empaths report that their brief, boundary-only messages generate less response, less pushback, less immediate hoovering than their longer, more emotionally detailed ones did, not because the narcissist suddenly developed respect for boundaries, but because the short message simply didn't give them anything to work with. Now let's talk about what happens after you send this message, because understanding the aftermath is just as important as understanding why the message itself needs to be short. Because sending it doesn't end the story from their side, even though it's designed to end it from yours. What follows in almost every case is a predictable sequence of attempts to reopen the conversation you just closed. And knowing what these attempts typically look like in advance is one of the most protective things you can do for yourself in the days and weeks that follow. The first response, if one comes at all, often arrives within hours or days, and it's usually calibrated to sound reasonable, even generous. Something like, "I just want to understand what happened," or "Can we at least talk about this like adults?" This message is designed to exploit a very specific vulnerability that the short, boundary-only message doesn't fully protect against on its own. Your genuine, deeply held belief that reasonable people should be able to have reasonable conversations, and that refusing to engage might make you the unreasonable one. I want to name this trap clearly because it catches almost every empath at least once. Reasonableness as a concept only functions between two people operating in good faith. A narcissist requesting one conversation after you've already stated your boundary isn't actually asking for closure. They're asking for another opportunity to work the angles that worked before, dressed up in language specifically chosen to make your refusal look unreasonable rather than protective. The correct response to this kind of follow-up message is no response at all. Not a second explanation of why you won't be talking. Not a firmer restatement of the boundary, simply nothing. This is genuinely one of the hardest things for an empath to do, because every social instinct you have says that ignoring someone who's asking, apparently sincerely, for understanding is rude, even cruel. It isn't. You already delivered your one message. It already said everything that needed saying. Responding again, even to restate the same boundary, reopens the exact door the short message was designed to close, because it proves once again that continued contact still produces a reaction from you. The second type of follow-up, and this one tends to arrive somewhat later, often after the reasonable conversation request has gone unanswered for a while, shifts tactics entirely. Manufactured urgency. A message about a shared responsibility, a piece of property, a mutual friend's crisis, something that seems to require your involvement regardless of the personal boundary you've set. This tactic works because it reframes engagement not as reopening the relationship, but as handling practical matters unrelated to the emotional content of the breakup. Sometimes these urgencies are genuinely real, and if you share children, finances, or other entangled practical matters, some communication may be genuinely unavoidable. But it's worth developing in advance a clear sense of what's actually urgent and practical versus what's dressed up to look that way. A message about signing a specific document by a specific legal deadline is different from a vague, "we need to talk about some things," that could mean almost anything. If practical contact is genuinely unavoidable in your situation, the same principle from the original message still applies. Keep it short, keep it factual, keep it free of emotional content. "I can sign the documents on Thursday. Please send them through my lawyer" contains no opening for further engagement. It handles what needs handling without inviting anything beyond it. The third pattern, and this one tends to arrive later still, sometimes weeks or months after the silence has held, is the return to warmth. Nostalgic messages, apparent vulnerability, sometimes even what looks like genuine self-reflection or growth. This is often the hardest pattern to resist because it doesn't feel like manipulation in the moment it arrives. It feels like exactly what you might have once hoped for, evidence that they finally understand, finally regret, finally see clearly what the relationship actually was. I want to be honest with you about this pattern specifically because it deserves more care than a simple dismissal. Sometimes, in a genuine minority of cases, this kind of message does reflect real growth. Most of the time, it doesn't. And the way to tell the difference isn't found in the words of a single message. It's found in sustained behavior, demonstrated consistently over a long period of time, independent of whether you're engaging with it at all. A single warm message, however sincere it sounds, is not evidence of that kind of sustained change. It's simply one data point, and one data point was never enough to justify reopening a door you closed for good reason. This is where the discipline of the original short message pays off most significantly, because it protects you from having to make this judgment call in real time, under emotional pressure, every single time a new message arrives. You already decided when you sent the first message that you weren't engaging further. That decision doesn't need to be reevaluated every time a new tactic arrives, testing whether it still holds. It holds because you decided it holds, not because each individual message failed to meet some threshold of convincingness. Here's something worth understanding about why these follow-up attempts eventually taper off, even when they don't produce the immediate silence you might hope for after the first one. Every unsuccessful attempt is information from the narcissist's side about how much effort continued pursuit is actually worth. A person whose relational strategy has always depended on efficiently identifying which tools produce results doesn't continue investing indefinitely in tools that consistently fail. This is why maintaining complete disciplined silence after your initial message matters more than almost anything else in this entire process. Every time you respond, even briefly, even just to restate the boundary one more time, you reset the narcissist's assessment of how much continued effort might eventually pay off. Complete silence, sustained long enough, eventually convinces even the most persistent narcissist that this particular avenue has genuinely closed. Not because they've had a change of heart, but because their own cost-benefit calculation running in the background the entire time finally tips toward redirecting their energy elsewhere. I want to address one more thing before we get to what this all means for you going forward, because it's a question that comes up constantly, and it deserves a direct answer. What if they never receive the message the way you intend it? What if they read your silence as cruelty, tell everyone you were cold and unreasonable, construct a narrative where you're the villain of this story rather than someone who finally appropriately protected herself. This fear keeps a lot of empaths trapped in longer, more detailed final messages than they actually want to send because some part of them is still hoping to control how the story gets told on the other end. Here's the truth worth sitting with clearly. You cannot control that story, no matter how carefully you word your final message. A narcissist determined to construct a flattering narrative about the breakup will do so regardless of what you actually said, because the narrative was never really about accuracy in the first place. A 10-paragraph, meticulously fair explanation of your reasons for leaving can be just as easily twisted into "she was cold and dramatic" as a 2-line boundary statement can. This brings us to the part of this story that actually matters most because everything we've discussed so far, the short message, the discipline of silence, the predictable follow-up attempts and how to withstand them, is really just mechanics. Useful mechanics, protective mechanics, but mechanics all the same. What they're actually in service of is something much larger, and it's worth naming clearly before we close this out. The entire point of the one message you send is to stop needing anything further from a person who was never going to give you what you actually needed anyway. Because here's what I want you to sit with honestly, even if it's uncomfortable. Somewhere underneath the instinct to write a long, detailed, explanatory message, there was almost certainly a hope that doing so would finally produce something. An apology, an acknowledgement, a version of them capable of seeing what you saw and validating that you weren't imagining it. That hope is completely understandable. It's also the exact hope this entire process is designed to help you release, because as long as you're waiting for that validation to arrive through them, your peace remains tethered to something entirely outside your control, something you have already learned. Through the whole relationship, they were never reliably capable of providing. The short message isn't just a protective tactic. It's a physical, concrete act of releasing that hope. Every word you leave out of it, every grievance you don't list, every explanation you don't provide, every plea for understanding you don't make, is a small, deliberate choice to stop waiting for something from them and start generating it, instead, entirely from within yourself. This is genuinely one of the hardest reframes in this entire process because it can feel in the moment like you're giving something up. You're not giving up your right to be understood. You're recognizing that the understanding you deserve was never actually available from this particular source, and redirecting your energy toward the only place it was ever actually going to come from. Your own clear-eyed knowledge of what happened, held without needing their agreement to make it true. Let's talk about what happens for you internally once the silence genuinely holds, once the follow-up attempts have tapered off, once weeks have turned into months without contact, once the discipline of not responding has become less like an act of willpower and more like simply how things are now. This is where the real payoff of the short message becomes visible, and it's worth understanding in advance so you recognize it when it starts to happen, rather than dismissing it or doubting whether it's real. The first thing that shifts is usually the physical response to their name, their number, any reminder of them that crosses your path unexpectedly. In the early days after no contact begins, these reminders often produce an immediate, visceral reaction, a tightening in your chest, a spike of anxiety, sometimes even a hopeful flutter that's almost more uncomfortable than the anxiety because some part of you still wants it to mean something. Over time, if the silence holds and you resist every urge to check, to look, to wonder what they're doing or saying, this reaction gradually flattens. Not because you've become cold or stopped caring in some absolute sense, but because your nervous system, no longer being fed new information to react to, slowly stops treating every mention of them as an emergency requiring your full attention. The second thing that shifts, usually somewhat later, is your relationship to the story of what happened. In the early aftermath, most people replay the relationship constantly, searching for the moment they should have seen it coming, the thing they could have done differently, the explanation that would finally make the whole confusing experience make sense. This replaying is exhausting, and it rarely produces the clarity it's searching for because you're trying to make rational sense of behavior that was never actually organized around rational, consistent logic in the first place. As the silence holds and the nervous system settles, this compulsive replaying tends to quiet down too, not because you've forgotten what happened, but because you no longer need to keep relitigating it in order to feel secure in what you know to be true. The third thing, and this is often the one that surprises people most, is a gradual, almost imperceptible shift in how much space the entire situation occupies in your daily thoughts. This doesn't happen on any predictable timeline, and it's not linear. There will be days, sometimes months into no contact, where something unexpected brings it all rushing back with startling intensity. This is normal, and it doesn't mean the healing wasn't real or that you're back at square one. It means grief. Even grief for a relationship that needed to end doesn't move in a straight line. But the overall trajectory for most people who maintain genuine disciplined silence is toward less frequency, less intensity, more days that pass without the relationship crossing your mind at all, until eventually those days become the default rather than the exception. Here's what I want you to understand about all of this. As we bring this story to a close, the one message worth sending when you go no contact isn't actually about them at all, even though it's addressed to them. It's the first concrete act of a much larger process, the process of stopping the labor of managing someone else's understanding of you and starting the much quieter, much more important work of trusting your own. Every message you don't send after that first one, every explanation you don't provide, every plea for acknowledgement you don't make is a small act of that same trust. Repeated until it becomes less like discipline and more like simply who you are. You are not required to make them understand. You were never actually required to, even during the relationship, though it may have felt that way for a very long time. Understanding, real understanding, was never something they were reliably capable of extending to you, and chasing it through increasingly careful, increasingly detailed final messages was never going to change that fundamental fact. What you can do, what the short message actually protects and makes possible, is something entirely within your own reach. Trusting what you know, protecting what you've built, and refusing to hand over any more of your internal world to someone who has already demonstrated repeatedly exactly what they do with it. Send the short message if you send anything at all. Then let the silence that follows do the rest of the work. Not because silence is cold, but because silence, held with discipline and without apology, is the only language that was ever actually going to end this story on your terms instead of theirs. They may never read that silence the way you mean it. They may tell their own version of the story, twist the ending into something that casts you as the villain, construct a narrative you'll never have the chance to correct. None of that changes what actually happened, and none of it changes what you actually know to be true. You already sent the only message that mattered. Everything after that belongs entirely to you.